How you guys doing? This is Andrew from FloryPB. My last video, when I went over the introduction to the first electronic paintball markers, which would be the Angel LED, this one pictured here was what I went over, and the PVI shocker. I promised I'd go more in depth on the LED and every Angel going forward after that. So here's the first set of videos of Angels and the differences of them. First, I want to talk about some of the different LEDs out there, and then we'll get into specific differences between the Angel LED and Angels going forward. They're definitely all laid out similarly, and they're all the same design aspect, but the LED has a lot fewer interchangeable parts than the rest of the Angels going forward. And, you know, it's a cool marker on its own right. We're definitely going to rebuild a couple of these. I'm just going to go over a couple of different kinds of LEDs that were available, the difference between model years, and we'll just keep going from there. Now this one, like I showed you the first time, it's around a 97 LED. If you notice, the mini reg isn't milled, where the later model LEDs are milled. And this has this push button on off in it. It's also designed a tiny bit different than this newer one, but we'll get into that a little more going forward in a little bit. Here's your original base stock LED. Nothing crazy, no milling, everything's just smooth. And we'll go into some of the aftermarket LEDs that were on the market for you. This is actually a Warp Sports LED. See if you can get the jewel there. Now this one itself is probably a 99. I don't exactly remember the year that Warp Sports started making LEDs. It had to be 98 or 99. But, oops. Let me fix that. That's what I get. Alright. So, again, this is a Warp Sports LED. There's nothing different about it, the way it was the way it functions than the standard LED. There's no special parts in it or anything like that. The only real difference is the milling. And this one actually, this is the one that works for me right now. The other one needs to get rebuilt, but LEDs all get turned on from right here. There's a little switch right here. There's just a little toggle switch. So you turn it on. That's why they get their name. Hope you can see that light. In the back, the little green light lights up, and every time you pull the trigger, it turns red as the solenoid goes. And yeah, this is the Warp Sports LED. One other neat feature on this is this is an adrenaline paintball mod. They actually take the exhaust ports from the solenoid, and these are supposed to link up to an adrenaline feed neck by a couple hoses, and they help push the paint down. It's one of the old ways to try to make paintball markers feed faster, because these could definitely rip, especially when people started cutting the trigger frames and putting double triggers on it. One tip when you're looking at these things, I'm going to go over some tips as we go, is everyone cut these things off, and you really got to check to see if it was like a factory cut, because sometimes these came cut from a factory, made from Warp Sports or from someone else. And really how these are machined here really dictates whether someone did it by a hacksaw or if they actually cut it nice. This one I'm pretty sure was cut by a factory somewhere, solely because this is rounded off nicely, and so is this, and because, you know, it's got re-anodized. Let's go in a little bit. If you can see the nice roundness here, that got machined well. It wasn't just cut with a hacksaw, or wasn't dremeled or hand filed down. That was machined to get that profile. So I think it's pretty safe to say this one was cut probably by Warp Sports to be a double trigger model. So it's probably later, around 99, that this one came out, solely because that happened. If it was early 98 or something like that, this might still be a single trigger. Which, you know, they're cool both ways. I prefer the single triggers myself. It's just funner to shoot them that way to me. But you can really rip on these with a double trigger. And, yeah, it's the Warp Sports one. It's one of my favorites. Nothing crazy. A little bit of simple milling there, but let's move on to another nice one, which is a Planet Eclipse LED. And I don't know if these had a special name to them, but this is a Planet Eclipse LED. And again, this is an older one. As we can see, the push button right here, it's a 97 or early 98. And if we notice, this one got hacked not by the factory, which is sad, but, you know, it happens. We zoom in here, we see this actually probably got machined down as well because it is nice and smooth and there's no marks on it or anything. But you see there's no anodizing here and there's no anodizing back here. See, either someone did a nice job with a file and did this nice and smooth, so it is a nice cut, or it got machined, but this was hacked off after the fact. Even though this is a matching trigger, I know you could... I've actually bought one of these on eBay in the same color pattern. I don't exactly remember what Eclipse called these color patterns. But I've bought these before, so these were available through Eclipse separately from the markers. Where this hack job got done at a later date, which is kind of sad. As you see, this is a 97 or early 98 because of this push button. So this should have came as a single trigger marker. So it's something you can do to identify them. Also, if you notice, the Eclipse jewel here replaces the Angel jewel that's on the other ones. Now I'll move on from that one. And I don't have all of them with me here, but I have a couple different ones that I find neat. Some of the neater ones that I like. This is probably one of my personal favorites. This is, I don't know if they call it an SE, but this is a Euro version of the Angel SE. We had the American SE, which I have one, but it's all busted up. It's not something I'm putting on this video right now. We might do it sometime in the future, but this is a Euro SE. I think these came out right around when 2000, at least the American versions did. I don't know when the European one came out, but there's a little bit different milling up at the sight rail. It's all milled a little differently. This Angel jewel is seen later on LCDs and other Angels like that. Here's the stock feed neck setup. The other ones I showed you really didn't have stock feed necks on them. The Eclipse did, but not them. This is another factory cut job, it seems, because the anodizing's there. You see how it's rounded off nice? So I believe this would be a factory cut. It's not like the Eclipse that had someone just hacked it off. Professionally, but it could get hacked off. And yeah, it's kind of neat. I've only remember really two companies that made a specific European marker and not just custom labeled markers. Angel did it a few times, or WDP did it a few times with Angels. They did it with this one, then they had a Euro speed in 04, 03 to 04, and I think that's the last time they did it, but they had a specific speed for Europe and a speed for America, and a dark speed for America too, a speed demon. But they did the European marker there, and then they did it again. Only company I ever remember doing that is AGD. They did a Euro X-Mag. And outside of that, I don't remember anyone ever offering a marker solely to Europe and not coming over here with it. It's kind of interesting. I mean, WDP was a British company, so yeah, that might help with it. But it is a little bit interesting fact behind them. Now, one thing I want to go over about the LED, one of the major differences, probably the first difference people realize, is the charging port on the LED is here. Where on every other Angel, it's down here in the grip frame. Also, the charging port is different. It looks different. It's kind of a proprietary thing. Here's an old LED charger. And it's the same charger, basically, as the newer ones, but the plug itself is different. If you're not familiar with them, you might get one without a charger or without a way to charge it. And you're kind of SOL. Come on. Hope you guys can see in there. But it's a 3-prong charger. I don't know what this is. I think it's a proprietary thing, like I said. Because I've never found this before, where the later ones are a more standard thing. And you can make a lot of chargers easily for them. These are a little trickier. And you always got to be careful about your charger with your LED, solely because of that reason. Outside of that, the battery that was in them was a NiCad battery, so that's crappier than the NIM batteries and the nickel metal hydride batteries that came later. And here's actually a little bit later battery. It's an LCD battery, but it's the same size. It's 5 of these 2/3 A battery cells put together in a series, and it makes 6 volts. So it's the same voltage as the future Angels. but it's just a different kind of battery originally, but you can replace it with a newer battery. The only real difference is the plug, and I'll show you that too, but battery sits in this tube here on your left side tube if you're shooting the marker. Sits right here like this, and the other tube is going to be for the actual firing of the marker. So I'll get into some of the smaller, or the more nuanced differences with these markers. So I showed you the two different mini regs. All of these LED mini regs are different than, well, that one's not coming off. All of these LED mini regs are different than the future generation Angels, at least up to the A4 and A4 Fly, because they had standard threaded half-inch NPT mini regs. These are a metric thread, which is a bit longer and takes a lot more screwing than the standard threads do, the NPT threads. But you gotta watch out for that. That's a custom size. There's not gonna find another regulator besides a mini reg that has that. And this part here was known as the crack pipe, because it goes here like this, and then it's got this little piece that shoots off into the trigger frame. And you could get these in standard threads from like Cap and other companies like that to fix that problem if you want to use a different regulator. Because these mini regs always looked cool and they were nice feeling, but they really are a really crappy regulator. In all honesty, it's probably one of the least functional high-end market regulators ever to come on these markers. And they changed them a little bit. There was a little bit of change between this version of the reg with the push button and the later version of the reg that has this milling and no push button here. There was a little bit of change, but the piston size never changed and the piston length never changed either. And they would still have a captured O-ring at the bottom. They're all the same, and I might be babbling a little bit, but I'll go over that when we break one of these down. But they're not a great reg because of that. If the piston's too tiny, it's a little heavy, the captured O-ring is not there. It's a O-ring that travels with it, so it's not a very good reg for recharge. And it's probably one of the crappier regs to ever come on a high-end marker like these. And keep in mind, these were expensive markers in their day. But these are two of the big differences you're going to see. The other major difference between newer markers is the trigger frame and the spacing of it. When you go past the LED and you get to like the LCD and the IR3, the trigger frame spacing and the boards are all pretty interchangeable. They're not going to work perfectly, but they're similar enough to go with each other. Where this one, the actual crack pipe goes into the trigger frame and it vents up to here to get into the valve. So this is completely different than the future trigger frames. It's a much smaller frame in general. Even this part is nicer to grip. I think it's nicer to grip. I don't have the biggest hands, and I like gripping these. I feel like their spacing on these are a little bit nicer than the little bit later ones. But the trigger frame's smaller. The board's different. Obviously, it's an LED board. Here's an old one of them. These came in two versions, I think, from the factory. You had this original one. This is the oldest one, where you have the dwell and I think it might be firing modes up here. I forget which one is which, but they're actually twist screws to actually adjust them, what your dwell is going to be and your firing mode and all that. Then they had a later one, the select fire, which they were on the front down here. I couldn't find one of those boards in my collection of crap laying around. But, you know, it's a simple board, but they do work. I mean, I haven't found many LED boards that were actually fried totally unless someone let the battery melt on them. And it's rock solid, basically. It's one of the, you know, it's not great. It's obviously lacks a lot versus a modern paintball setup. But it has everything you need to actually shoot the marker. And they are pretty robust and stand through time pretty well. It's kind of funny because I have these old parts for these boards, old resistors and everything. So these were parts that were supposed to be, because it's such a simple board, it was supposed to be fixed instead of just thrown away with a new board put in their place. I'm still not sure what this is for, but so that's the difference in the boards. Now the other big difference, the major difference with the LED and every other Angel going forward is the wiring harness, how the wires were set up. The LED, like I showed you on the board, has this one single header at the top that all the wires plug into. And the wiring harness is literally a rat's nest that looks like this. It's horrible. The wires are super thin because there's some aluminum wires. They're not the copper wires that are used in the later model Angels. And this is a big rat's nest. The micro switch. This is, sorry, I should go back. This is just a spare harness I pull parts off of, but you get the point. All these wires are just rattling around in it. The micro switch used to be attached to this as well, which gets pinned into the marker itself, and you got to take that out to try to get the trigger frame off. It's a big pain in the ass. This is the original battery connector, kind of like an RC car connector. That got changed going forward, and basically every Angel going forward from that had a very similar battery setup, and it was all the same, and this one was just different than the rest of them. There's the LED light. Here's the back of your solenoid. Your solenoid was much different in this Angel than future Angels to it, partially because the technology out in 97 versus 2000 was much different. Definitely a field that went very advanced, very fast through the time that we started getting more advanced in paintball markers. But these wires are a pain in the ass, especially when you're trying to put the trigger frame back together, getting them all organized, getting them in there nice so they don't get pinched. And it's one of the harder things to do with this Angel, and why this Angel is probably one of the hardest Angels to actually work on, is because of this damn wiring loom that they have in it. But they learned from that, and they definitely upgraded and refined it going forward. So next time when we do an in-depth view of the LCD and the IR3, which is the X2 high-pressure Angels, you'll see that the wiring is much more refined. There's plugs on the board. You can get the frame off pretty easily. You don't got to take the whole crack pipe, vertical ASA off, and get the wiring harness out. It's not a big mess to get your frame off anymore, but your frames get bigger through time. Speaking of the solenoid and the LCDs are huge. This whole top tube is basically your solenoid and the housing for it. This big aluminum housing for this solenoid. The solenoid itself is a monster. It looks like this. Then this little piece off your wiring loom goes in the back here and just bolts in, and that controls your air, which controls your spool, which again is massive compared to a modern paintball marker and modern standards. Just big parts. For comparison, here's an LCD solenoid, which is pretty much was a paintball standard for a while, solenoid this size. And look at the LCD solenoid with the actual electrical component, fits inside the frame, or fits inside the same footprint as just the solenoid housing on the LCD. One good thing about the LCD probably was the ports are massive on it, but they do restrict them a lot to get them back down. Angels never really had a problem with recharge or shoot down for the most part if you tuned them decently, but this is a good reason why the LEDs can really rip if you want them to. So they have massive flow in their solenoid just for the size of the damn thing. Another major difference between the LCD and the markers going forward all the way up to the A4 and A4 Fly is the bolt. The actual breech is a tiny bit shorter than the LCD to the A4 Fly. Every one of those breeches are the same size, and they can all pretty much take the same bolts. But this one, well, that doesn't have a bolt in it. You do. This breech is shorter. It's not only shorter, it's also a smaller diameter. The LED bolt is a smaller diameter than the LCD going forward. They used a fatter bolt, which at the time was probably better because paint used to be big back then, and now it's kind of tiny, so this breech actually works better with modern paint than like an LCD does. But the marker has this shorter bolt. I don't exactly know why they made this longer going forward. Maybe, I really can't think of a great reason why they did it, unless these pins were failing because there wasn't so much meat behind them. But outside of that, I don't really know why they did that. This is a Venturi Face. All the old Angels came with Venturi Face bolts, which are kind of crap if you think about airflow and how that actually works. You definitely want an open face bolt. But they did these kind of well. Look at a Venturi. If you look at a Venturi bolt and you're going to go with something like this, always look how this was made here. If this is just scooped in on both sides, that's a worse flow pattern than this here, where it's rounded off here and it's allowed to flow in, and this is cut flat. It's a better airflow profile than when it's just scooped in, like you can see on some old autococker bolts. So definitely look at that if you're looking at different markers. All Angels came like this though, all the way up to the 04 speed until the A4s. That's when they started getting the soft face and they switched the style, which is a better flowing bolt than this one. But I see why they did this. Venturi was kind of the rage back then, and it helped keep the paint from rolling back, which again is a very inherent problem with the Angel. If there's two flaws with the Angel, it's that they never combated this breech design until the G7, where you have this gap. This is a good Angel to show this on. Let me see if I can zoom into that for you. Or not zoom in, but focus that. It's a good marker to show it on. Because we have our feed neck here, and the feed neck has a little meat, and there needs to be a little bit of threading, you got this gap from where your ball can actually fall in the breech to where the face of the bolt is going to be, because it has to go into this roto breech. Now with the G7, they made it so when you actually clamp down when you clamp down your roto breech, you push the ram forward slightly, so push the bolt forward slightly and took up that gap. Until that point, the best thing you could really do is try to get a longer bolt. I know, I think Doc Nickel made, they called them Dynabolts maybe. They actually extended into the breech a little bit with a spring, which is a really good idea. And the other thing you did was you always adjusted your ram to be as far forward as you could to try to cut into the space as much as you possibly can. Another tuning tip I always do at Angels is I try to always limit this gap as much as possible. Bring this breech forward, because you got two screws, a screw on both sides and two pins that hold this in, and I try to bring it as close as possible to the front. One reason to help push everything forward and make less rollback issues happen, but the other reason is because your bolt actually gets fired, or the air actually goes through your roto breech here. So when you have a gap there, because this bolt doesn't have O-rings, it has to go through this piece into this piece, so it can't be the tightest fit ever. Like any other marker could really be a lot tighter than this one can. As far as the bolt diameter, it doesn't mean they are, but they can be. So you lose a lot of air basically because your bolt's a little loose. It has to go through this slot. And if you have a bigger gap here, you're going to lose more air than if you have a tighter gap there. So you're a little less efficient. It's a nice way to gain a tiny bit of efficiency out of these markers. Doesn't do much, but it's just one of those things to try to make them as nice as you can without doing anything crazy to it other than just what your standard thing would be. Now, another major thing you're going to see with the LED versus the more modern Angels is a lot of the bolts are different. Obviously, these old LEDs, they take these 45 grips off like an old autococker, or actually a 1911 pistol, I think, is what all these things were based off of. But it's only two screws, where any Angel going forward has a 3-screw setup. Your actual grip frame screws, most other Angels have different sized ones. These are a constant size, and these are a little bit longer than some of like the LCD bolts. Your crack pipe is a different screw length. It's still an M4 screw, but it's a different screw length than your LCD and everything going forward to it. Even these two screws. These two screws are the screws you got to worry about, actually, in all these markers. The two screws that hold the actual breech in, you have one up here in the front and one in the back. Every screw on this marker is metric, minus these two. There's some weird British screw that actually has standard threading. It's not a standard thread, but it's all US based measurements on them, and they take just standard Allen keys instead of metric keys. So they're very strange. They're a bitch to try to find if you lose them, so don't lose these things. People strip them out real easy because they think it's an Angel and they think it's a metric marker, and they have their metric Allen set, and they undo their marker and everything. They try to get these out and they strip them out because these are the only two standard screws in the standard Allen keys in the marker. They're not standard screws. They're very strange. I forget the name of them right now, but it'll come back to me sooner or later. Very hard to source these, so try not to lose these. The LED has two longer ones when you get towards like the LCD and the IR3 and stuff like that. One's longer, one's shorter, and they alter a little bit, but this has two longer ones than the markers that most commonly are associated with it. The other thing that's different is this pin. There's two pins at the bottom of the Angels always. There's one for your actual valve, and there's one for your LPR. Your valve one sits about here. The LPR sits here. This has a mushroom head on it. On the LEDs, everything going forward, the pin gets hidden underneath the flash tank on the bottom of the VASA. So this is a little different. It's this bigger one. I think it's bigger so it catches this crack pipe so it can't just fall out. It was a fine idea. They do work fine. These are a little harder to get out sometimes. They definitely get jammed up a little easier than the LCD stuff does. Mostly because it's exposed, where everything else is kind of enclosed in something. So they can rust up a little bit faster. The other major difference is the actual breech pin, the pin that goes through to hold your breech in place. It's longer in the LED than the LCD, and the IR3 shorter than both of them, but this is the longest breech pin that you're going to have, because this section for the solenoid, this massive solenoid section, is bigger and your actual breech is smaller than the LCD and the IR3. So you have a longer one of these, same threading, takes the same actual pull knobs and everything, so that's not a problem, but the breech pin itself, you know, if you lose it, you're going to have kind of a bitch of a time trying to find a new one. You know, besides that, the feed neck threading is the same going on all Angels. The barrel threading is the same up to the G7. Then they kind of fucked around with it with the G7 Fly. Then they changed it again with the A1, which really kind of screwed the pooch out of everything. Ball detent, same ball detent going up to the IR3. Then they switched over to a dual system in the 04 speed and stuck with something similar to that going forward. And you know, they all work pretty well. I do like Angel ball detents. They're spring-style detents with a ball bearing, a plastic ball bearing. They never really die until you let the spring rot out. But it's a very reliable system that just constantly works to me. So I do like those a hell of a lot. Now, a couple of the standard things you're going to see. If you go to this side, we're going to go to this side. This is the driver's side of the marker, I guess. Because this is where your RAM cartridge sits back here, your valve sits here, and your LPR sits here. That's what the old RAM looks like. These are super reliable in these older markers like this. This one's beat the hell, but super reliable. You can open them up if you have the right tools. I'll show you how to do that in a later video, but you can open them up to service these. They're very nice for that. And they're rock solid. These are rock solid RAMs. They do take these two pins. This annoyed a lot of people in the past. That was that tool I showed you last time. So let me try to find it again. Maybe I didn't show you this tool. This tool here. That goes in there like that. And then you can spin the RAM out and put it in. Well, screwed that up. This RAM's a little fucked up, but you can take the RAM out with that tool. Also use a set of pliers, like a specialty set of pliers. I have this set of jeweler's pliers that you can use to get this thing out and in. The neat part about these RAMs, part I really liked about them, besides they were very robust, they're very nicely machined, was this little brass screw in the back. A lot of people underestimate this. This is actually called the snap ring screw. And what that does is there's an O-ring underneath this brass screw. Take this out and show you. See if we can get this out. Yeah, there we go. So this screw looks like this. It's a brass screw. It's got a hollow point in there. And if I bring this over here and try to get some light on it, there we go. If you look down in there, I hope you can see it. There's an O-ring, and then the back end of the actual ram shaft itself has a little prong section that goes through the O-ring. And the whole point of this is this screw with this hollow point here, this actually gets tightened down and compresses that O-ring. And that fills into the slot to put friction on the back of the ram shaft. And what that does is it lets the ram build up full pressure before it lets it shoot forward. So that holds the ram back at a slight delay to let it build up pressure so it can actually pop out. Like if you go back and you can press down and there's this little section, it doesn't go, and you actually pop it in. And that's the snap ring. That was a very good idea to combat first shot drop off, which, you know, and maybe more than just first shot drop off, partially because these regs suck so bad, the mini regs, that they probably starved the marker a little bit. The LPRs in these are actually very good, but the mini regs are very bad, which is kind of funny. But that's all Angels going forward to, I think, the A1s when things got weirder. Sorry about that, guys. My camera had a little bit of a brain fart and cut out on me. We're back. I was just talking about the RAM, and now we're going to move forward from the RAM towards the valve. The original Angel LED valve was this one. I don't have a valve stem for it, actually, or a cup seal, I guess you would call it. This is what the original one looked like. Now, this valve is the same dimension as the LED, the LCD, and the IR3, all the same valve dimension. So you can change each valve to each marker. The LCD valve and the IR3 valve are the same valve. And a lot of people upgrade it because the cup seal kind of goes on these. It looks more like an old autococker cup seal, like a really old autococker cup seal. And it worked, but it was definitely a failure point of these old Angels. One of the few failure points, in my opinion. One of the major ones. But a lot of times you replace them with an LCD valve, which looks like that. There's no actual real difference between them performance-wise. But the LCD stuff you can still get parts for. And these cup seals still go. They're not the strongest part of the Angel. Probably something, if you buy an old Angel, you're going to expect to change your cup seal out because they do die through time. You got to keep them lubed. That definitely helps them, keeping oil on them. But this is the LCD valve, and they're exactly the same size. They interchange very simply between markers. Then the spring sits in front of that, and the LPR sits in front of the spring, like that, in the tube. So you got your RAM cartridge in the back, you got your valve, then your LPR sitting in front of it. Now this LPR, like I said, the mini reg's terrible, but these LPRs are really actually very good. It's a very big surface area on it, which helps it move faster because it can build force faster. There's more area to build it with. It's actually a bigger piston on this than there is on than the mini reg. And the mini reg has an O-ring back here that slides with it, a dynamic O-ring, where this is a captured O-ring. So this is actually, it works exactly the same as the mini reg as far as it's an inline regulator, but this is a much better reg than the mini reg is. So these regs are probably some of the best LPRs in paintball, and definitely for the longest time were probably the best LPR in paintball. Had the biggest piston, it probably worked the fastest, and it was probably one of the better regs. They were a bitch to adjust. People thought they were a bitch to adjust because what you do is the front here, you have a thread. I think it's a M2 or an M3, I forget off the top of my head what thread size it is. But you take the little LPR tool, and it's just this tool here that tapers in, and it's got a threaded tip on it, and you bring it in and you tighten it in, and you pull your piston out. Then this part always gets caught up because you got the pin you got to pull out the bottom of the marker and push it forward. But this is a very, very nice LPR. And you always change the pressure of these. Now this is an LCD or an IR3, I forget which one because they're basically the same. With the old LED ones, you could actually adjust this up or down, which adjusts your pressure just like any inline regulator. You don't have to, though, because normally you just put shims on the front of it to get more reg pressure. And they had shim kits for that. These are very nice regs. They always sat in front of the valves like that on the older ones. When you get to the 04 speed and stuff, that's when they switch over to the other side of the marker, and it's a more low-pressure marker. And that's when things change, but all the way from the LED all the way up to the IR3, all of this here is identical. The RAM gets shorter in the IR3, but I'll show you that when we get to those markers. But again, very robust system, minus the cup seal failure. That's really the only part of this that really fails often. Everything else is kind of unusual to see it actually fail. But yeah, they're very strong markers as far as that stuff goes. Now, one more thing I want to do before we're done with this is, I want to go over some of the failure points of these markers, some things to look out for if you're trying to buy an old one. Again, number one, expect your cup seal to be bad. Your cup seal is always going to be a problem with these old markers. You're always going to need to get a new one, or hopefully it works. Leave it in oil overnight, see if you can get the seal up again, but chances are you should get a new one. The other thing with these is the electrical system. People might break wires in it. I've taken some of these apart that were literally disintegrated because the battery was allowed to pop in the marker, the old NiCad battery, and it just burnt it out basically, and I pull the switch off and it just breaks apart in the hand and the micro switch falls apart. So, and it's very hard to find a factory setup, especially for cheap, so it's It's kind of a pain in the ass to put one together for this marker, put a new wiring loom together. So look for that with these markers. It's definitely a big problem with these. The other thing to always look out for is breech failures. Definitely open your breech, check back here, because this is a point where a pin goes in. These get pushed around a lot. People hit these. So sometimes the pin rips through here, or on this side you have 2 pins, so it could rip through and you could see a hole forming in this thing. And you know that it might not destroy the marker, but it doesn't look great. And if you can avoid it. If you don't mind it, whatever. But just look for it. It's definitely a failure point you should look for. The other part that I suggest you guys look at is because of this the back plate here. It's very thin around this back plate. If someone accidentally drops this marker hard, it always dents this stuff back here. So you're always going to see a dent sometimes. So always check to see if there's a dent. That's going to give you problems if there is. Most of the time, you can't get the back plate off, can't put it back on. It just doesn't look good. It's hard to get rid of, especially if you're even trying to re-anno it. You're still going to see flaws because of that. And you know, it's easy to drop these marks, especially when they're this old. And when you do, you can definitely dent this back plate, or dent the actual the rim around the back plate, because it's not a very thick section of metal. So always look out for that when you're looking for these old ones. And outside of that, they're very solid. The LPR is going to be pretty strong. You might expect to rebuild all the O-rings. The solenoids, these are a bitch to put in and out because of these O-rings and how loose they actually fit in here. And they get snagged up. There's tricks. I'll definitely show you how to take that in and out when we do one. But normally this is pretty rock solid. If anything fails, it's this part. And if you're smart, you're going to see that this particular part of this solenoid is used on many, many, many different paintball markers. And you can just take it off that and put it on this. Hint, hint, it's the same part on the newer one, the newer LCD solenoid as the older one. So I'd always try to replace this before I try to take the solenoid out, just because it's such a pain in the ass to get back in. But they are very strong markers. They are an absolute blast to shoot these. They're definitely heavy, but they're plenty efficient. They make a cool noise. It's pretty loud compared to a modern spool valve marker, but it's not so loud that it's annoying to me, at least. They just shoot. They have a nice amount of kick. It's not too much, but it's just enough to know that you're actually shooting something, and it feels kind of nice. Definitely heavy, but super reliable. You can get most of these going just a little bit of oil and a battery, and you get them mostly going. And they're just super reliable, super fun to shoot. If you have a good stomach for it, you think you can do it yourself, or you can want to send it to somebody, you can get these things up and running. If it's not missing parts, and it's not hard to find parts, they're easy enough to get up and running for you. Check the barrel, make sure this didn't get dented either, obviously. One thing I didn't talk about, your front plugs, make sure they're not stripped out. People have a habit of stripping these out because they are thin thread, but they are standard in every Angel to the G7. That's when they change. And maybe the 06 Speed, they're not the same there. But yeah, these are standard in the Angels going forward. Just make sure they're there. This one obviously doesn't matter too much in this one, but make sure it's not all stripped out. And yeah, that's about it. They're great markers. If you guys have any more questions about them, please leave comments. Please feel free. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe. We're going to start doing the LCD next, and then start building some of these back up, bringing them from the grave and putting them back into use. Again, this is Andrew at FloryPB. Thank you.